not a student over on campus, but I really love houseplants. I've been collecting and sharing rare plants for quite a while at this point. I started growing plants in my junior year of college, and it has just kind of exploded ever since. So I have now run the website How to Speak a Plant, and I wrote a book. So the book is coming out here very, very soon. Pre-orders are now available if you're interested. I have some excerpts over here. Obviously, that's not how the book will look eventually. These are just samples if you're curious. And so I have just really enjoyed propagating plants, and I've sold to Caras a few times. You may have seen my stickers around. I haven't done it for a while, but and so I thought it'd be very fun to come and share all about propagation, and we'll talk a little bit about repotting and soil mixes and things like that as there's time. Okay, so I'm going to assume, I know there's a lot of Caras people here, we're going to just assume that everyone knows absolutely nothing about propagating, because I think starting with the basics is always really good. Yeah. And so the number one question you should always start with when you're propagating is deciding what part of the plant you actually need to cut and have when you're propagating. For the majority of houseplants, you need a node, which is just kind of a common term for the area on the stem where the petiole connects to the stem. And so if you really want to get deep into cellular biology, that's called the meristem. In monocots, it's the intercalary meristem. In dicots, it's a lateral meristem. And so that is an area of stem cells, or just undifferentiated cells that can turn into anything. That's kind of where they're located on plants. So that's what you need to grow roots and a new growth point. So for monocots like philodendrons, that tends to be really, really easy. And so that is just when you want to take a cutting, you're going to aim for in between two nodes, just anywhere you want. And so then now, if you want, you can cut up, and every single leaf can become a new plant if you really want to. I always recommend that people go in between the two nodes instead of trying to get really close to any of them. If you cut too close to the node, you can damage that area and it won't actually produce a new growth point. So you want to try and give it as much room as you can. If you use cuttings with multiple leaves, then you'll have more chances to save your cutting if you start having problems with rot or it's just not taking very well. So I like using more than one leaf personally, but you can just do one at a time. And the other reason for cutting in between nodes instead of really close to one is that then you have this whole space. If you start having rot, then you can cut a little bit more and do some more treatments, and you have just that much more space to maintain your cutting. Especially if you're doing rare cuttings where you just bought a cutting from somebody, that's always what I like to do. There are a ton of different ways that you can then get this cutting to grow into a plant. The easiest way, as you guys see in my little brochure, is just using some water, and all you do is you just put some water in your cup, and you just put the plant in the water. If you can, it's sometimes handy to cut off the leaves that are going to be under the surface of the water, just because they can get in the way and they can start to rot sometimes. And then you'll have multiple nodes that can grow roots. If you do just one leaf with one node, sometimes it can get a little squished to try and get the roots and the growth point in there at the same time. So it's nice to use more than one, but I also like just getting as many plants as possible at once. The next way that people will commonly do it is just with some soil. And so I like to use just an actual nursery pot because it makes it easier to then constantly watering. And all you need to do is basically pretend that your cutting is going to be a regular plant. And so we'll take another cutting, and then we just stick it in the dirt. And that is all you need to do. I find that cuttings in soil are much more successful grown under a humidity dome or in an indoor greenhouse, something that's just really high humidity. I found that there are a lot of vinyl collapsible greenhouses, anywhere from something that's just tabletop to I have one that's about 5 shelves high that you can just fill with propagations. And the high humidity helps encourage the plant to grow roots, which I think is nice. And then in the very similar way to soil propagation, you can also use pretty much any other substrate that you'll commonly use with plants. So like cocoa core is a really common propagation method. Perlite or vermiculite, those are two different kinds of just really highly porous volcanic rock, glass rock. Sand works, really like sand. It has a little bit less airflow, so it's nice to avoid sand, but if that's all you have, you may as well use it. Or sphagnum moss is another great resource. And so again, just very much like soil, all you need to do is you're going to fill your cup with whatever substrate you're using. And we'll tuck our propagation into the substrate, just like you would with dirt. And then you'll fill this, your substrate with just a little bit of water. You're going for kind of holding moisture rather than a soggy environment. If you're using things like cocoa coir, you don't want to get a lot of fungal growth. You're always going to have fungus in every environment. That's just part of the universe, is we have fungus here on Earth. But the problem is when it's too wet for too long. That is when fungus and bacteria starts to grow out of control and you'll run into problems with rot. So the goal is damp, not soggy. So you can do this with pretty much any kind of substrate you like. Some methods are going to be better for some kinds of plants than others, and some people like some methods better than others, so just kind of play around with it and figure out what you like best. And then the other way that I really like to do is using a propagation box. So it can be pretty much anything. This is one of my boxes from Whole Foods store, and I got some things at their salad station, and this is now a beautiful propagation box. And so with any of the substrates that you would use with any of the other methods, whether it be just even soil or sphagnum moss, what you want to do is put a little layer in the bottom. And just not anything too deep, you just kind of want something there to hold on to moisture again. So just something little. And then we can just put our petting just in the box. And you don't need to bury it, you can just put it on top of your substrate and mist it, or you can pour in just a little bit of water and then close your box and put it somewhere sunny. So it's basically acting as a little tiny greenhouse, so it holds high humidity in here, and it really encourages root growth. It kind of is mimicking the rainforest where you have really high humidity all the time, you have crazy root growth everywhere. So that's a very fun method as well. That's kind of the basics for monocot propagation and just almost every houseplant. That's probably the majority of them. Any questions about any of that before I move on to the next kind of plant? Alright, so with dicots, a lot of dicots, not all of them, like peperonias are a really good one, where these have lateral-bearing stems, which means all throughout all of the leaf phase are all areas that they can produce roots in a new growth point. Not all peperonias, but almost all of them. And so that means you can use pretty much any part of your leaf. You can propagate using the petiole, or the stem, or even the leaf veins. So I'll usually do kind of a double method here with my peperonias because I like to just maximize growth. So what I'll very often do is I'll use the petiole just in a cup of water for growing roots, and it'll make a new little teeny tiny baby plant off of the bottom. And so that'll be in my water. And then I'll cut across the leaf. And then the edge of the leaf will go in my propagation box, just kind of vertical like this. You can cut leaves into multiple pieces, and then each leaf vein is capable of producing both roots and a new plant, which is very fun. Begonias are also a really common one. The caning begonias are not very reliable using this method, but Rex begonias and all the just the rhizome type begonias are all really good at that method. With plants like orchids, they make basically little tiny clones off of the flower spikes. So with people who are kind of being introduced to orchids, they will often have an issue with the flower spike dying after the flowers are gone. And in that case, you're going to have to just wait for another flower spike to really be able to propagate particularly well. With a lot of the moth orchids, the Phalaenopsis orchids that you can find at the grocery store, things like that, a great way to help encourage them to grow a clone or is, again, growing them in really high humidity. I think that's just a really reliable method for all kinds of plants. And so then after all the flowers die, each of those little spots is capable of producing a new clone. And so again, little leaves will sprout, and then eventually they'll grow roots. And once they start growing roots, you can start treating them as their own orchid, which is very fun. Some orchids are more propagate division, so you just split the plant. Sometimes it can tie themselves really, really tightly together with their roots, and so you want to be kind of gentle with that and not rip them apart. But so some orchids are more of a division propagation than anything. Plants like calatheas are also split by division, where you have plants that propagate using rhizomes under the soil. So a rhizome is basically a stem that grows sideways under the soil and then will grow a new plant somewhere else. And so when you're splitting those kinds of plants, then you'll kind of take it out of the pot, remove the soil, cut the rhizome, and then you have a new plant. So that's also a relatively common method for kind of more herb type plants. But I think of like little bushy plants like calatheas are the easiest one to remember. So I think one of the more confusing parts, especially for beginners, after your cutting has grown, you have roots, is then trying to pick what size of pot you want to use. And so the thing about bringing the outside into your house is that you're removing your plant from the natural water cycle, from the natural cycles of evaporation and nutrient cycle. And so you kind of have to artificially change the environment of your plant to make up for those things that it's now missing. So you want to make sure that you're not leaving the soil very wet. It's outside, you have sunshine and wind that's going to dry out that soil continuously when you have evaporation and transpiration and all of those good things. But inside, you really don't have a kind of evaporation that you have outdoors. So you want to be careful with the amount of water that you put into your soil. Again, fungus and bacteria really love soggy, wet environments. And so you want to keep the size of the pot smaller, because the smaller pot means less soil, less volume to hold onto water, and the plant has a better opportunity to actually use the water that's in the soil itself. When you're choosing a pot for your plant, you want to go for something that's about, I always look at the volume of the foliage. If you imagine there's a sphere around your plant, that's about how big you want the pot to be. So this is pretty much perfect. The other thing you can do, if you're just wondering if your plant needs to be repotted, you just pull it out. Just look at the root ball. So this, you see, a little bit of roots, but a fair amount of dirt as well, which means this is in a perfect size pot. If you pull your plant out of the pot and it just kind of dumps a bunch of soil and you don't see all that many roots, that is in a pot that is way too big. You really want to see a good mix of both soil and roots when you pull your plant out of the pot. And if you pull it out and it's just full of roots, like I know that philodendron would be a great example, because I'm certain that there are lots of roots. See a lot at the bottom. It's definitely a plant that needs to be repotted. So we start seeing lots of roots coming out the bottom, and you'll just kind of see them packed in, which a lot of people don't. It's a common phrase. So here, and that's usually a sign if your plant needs to be repotted. So beginners often really like to use really giant pots, because it's the same concept as a goldfish. The goldfish will grow into the same the size of environment it has. That is not true for plants. You're trying to balance that water cycle with evaporation, and the plant can only use so much water so fast, and so you want to minimize how much water you're giving it at any one time, so you're not encouraging fungal growth and bacterial growth. Any questions about that? I saw lots of smiles, so I feel like that was a good topic to talk about. Another thing that can be really helpful, especially for more of the true tropicals and the climbing plants, the aeroids like monsteras and philodendrons, is using soil that is more airy. So to increase airflow in soil, you want to use particles that are larger. So that's why when you have a commercial indoor potting mix, you'll see dirt and then lots of little chunks in it of all different sizes. Things like perlite and vermiculite are really, really common in those commercial soil mixes, because they increase the amount of air in the soil itself and decreases how much moisture is held on in the soil. Larger particle size means less water can be held in that environment. And so when you're using, or when you're growing plants that like more of an arid environment, like orchids or aeroids, things like that, where they really like that airflow, when they grow on the sides of the trees in the wild, you can really increase the particle size of the soil that you're using. That's when you'll see a lot of kind of bark and soil together, mixed together. Orchids mostly only want to grow on bark planks or just in a bark mix without any soil. That makes them pretty unhappy. Orchids rot really easily if planted in soil. They can be planted exclusively in bark. And then other plants like philodendrons, you can do like a 50-50 bark and soil if you would like, or you can do all kinds of your different mixes. Each kind of material that you can add to your soil is going to do slightly different things. So cocoa core, this is a good way to hold on to moisture. It's a little bit more acidic than some of your other additives that you can use, so that's a good thing to keep in mind if you have really sensitive plants. That tends to not be intro-level houseplants, tends to be more the expert level, more rare plants. You'll want to start getting into acidity and things like that, but that's a little bit farther down the line. This is a great example of an orchid mix. Black Gold, I actually really love this company myself. They make really lovely orchid mixes. Vermiculite is essentially the same as perlite. Mix it in with soil just to increase airflow. And you can use that just for regular soil if you don't want to put in bark. Perlite's a great kind of intermediate as well. Peat and sphagnum moss are also really high moisture holders, I guess. So more sphagnum and more peat, your soil is going to hold on to a lot more moisture. So that's great for plants like carnivorous plants, so Venus flytraps, sundews, all of those kinds of things. They love really low nutrient and high moisture environments. So sphagnum moss mixed with sand is excellent for carnivorous plants. Carnivorous plants tend to be native to bogs, which are very waterlogged, not a whole lot of nutrients, and so putting them in regular topsoil can kill them. Is there any other kinds of plants that you want to know how to propagate, or any particular questions that I haven't covered?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So your pamphlet mentions root growth hormone.
Yeah.
If you've already started propagating something, can you add that to the water?
I definitely have in the past. I do not have any scientific studies that says that it changes anything. I like to do that, so I totally forgot to talk about that, so thank you. So in the pamphlet, you can see that picture that has all the different types of treatments on the end of your cutting. Those are all different ways you can treat that cut surface of your cutting to prevent rot and infection. Any wound on your plant, just like a person, is going to be an opportunity for infection and causing problems. And so those are all different ways you can play with that some will work better than others for helping to protect that cut surface and also encouraging the plant to continue to grow. So rooting hormone, there's both powders and gels. It is an actual hormone that encourages the plant to grow more roots. And so you can put it onto the cut end with a gel, you just kind of dip it in. Or I do actually like to put rooting hormone just in the water. It makes it look kind of sparkly and silvery. It's kind of fun. I think it helps. I have no science to tell you that it does indeed help. Rooting hormone in general, it does make a difference. Whether it makes a difference in the water, I'm not sure. Cinnamon is a thing that I totally did not believe for a very long time. That sounded like an old wives' tale, but I did quite a bit of research on this, and they have shown that there's a statistically significant difference in plants with and without cinnamon. That cinnamon reduces microbial growth, and there's some evidence that it also encourages plant growth. They've shown that in tomatoes. So take that for whatever that's worth. So cinnamon can be a great resource to help cut down on microbial growth, and it might even encourage a plant to grow some more. I'll sometimes put it into soil, in my soil mix, with plants that really like more damp soils like ferns and labias. Again, not sure how much it helps, but it makes me feel better to do that sometimes. And you can also mix together the cinnamon and the rooting hormone if you just want to really go all in with your plant. The other thing that I did not put in my brochure, if you really want to go for it, you can mix together your cinnamon and your rooting hormone, let it dry, and then dip it in wax. If you just want to go all out, you can do all 4 of those treatments to one single cutting. So it kind of depends how much you want to play around with your cutting, how attached you are to a particular cutting, and how much you really want to protect it. A lot of my cuttings, I don't do anything to them. I just cut them, stick them in water, stick them in dirt, and they do fine. But some do better with different treatments. Some plants, ones that are really highly vascular, or they're kind of fleshy, like begonias are a great example, where the petioles and the stems, when you feel them, they're not quite as stiff as like a philodendron stem. They will not be very happy if you let them dry out. Zebra plants are another great example. You should not put anything on the end of the plant. Just put it in water and it will grow happily. Don't put things on the end of zebra plants. They're But so any plants that when you cut it, it just seems like there's a lot of moisture inside the stem and it's not as woody. Those tend to be plants you should probably avoid drying or putting wax on the end. Rooting hormone usually is still a good thing that you can use, but you want to avoid just completely sealing off that surface for plants that like a lot of water.
Is this wax just hot?
Yeah, so I just let it sit for a while, and I blow out the flame because I'm clumsy and I don't want to roast my plant, and then just typically hot wax, and that's another reason why it's really good to give yourself room between your cut point and your node, so you're not putting things like hot wax on your node. That's not a great way to make a happy cutting. Do I see another question? I do think that some kinds of plants do better with different types of propagation methods. So Marantas, I think, the prayer plant family, they tend to do better in soil propagation in high humidity. I have never been able to successfully propagate a prayer plant in water and then transfer to soil. They always defect. I don't know why. And so that tends to be one that's really good to just stick it in soil. If you don't have the humidity to dome, you can use a clear plastic bag and just tie an air bubble around your plant. That's a great way to do it too. Just whatever you can do to just keep humidity around your plant, that's when you get that really nice root growth. You'll probably see a lot of root hair when you do that, which is one of my very favorite things. People sometimes panic and they think that their roots are moldy, but root hair is it's a specialized growth that increases the surface area of the roots, so it helps the plant take up moisture and nutrients faster. And so high humidity environments really encourage root hair growth, which is very fun. I like it. Any more questions?
Let's see. The snake plants, are they the, so when I look at my roots, they're kind of the ones that go down or shoot off, and so you just put them between the.
Yeah, and snake plants, you can also use their leaves. The biggest thing when propagating a snake plant is remembering which direction the plant goes. So a good way to propagate a snake plant and keep the veins going in the right direction is to cut a V into the leaf. And so then you'll have the bottom cut point goes in your water or your soil, whatever substrate you're using, and roots will come out the bottom and it will eventually grow a new plant. Keep in mind that variegated snake plants, if you want to keep the variegation, you have to do division. You can't do leaf cutting or the invert. You don't get a new variegated plant if you're doing a leaf cutting, which is weird, and I don't know why they do that. So you have a variegated snake plant, and you really want it, to propagate more. You just have to be patient, wait for it to put out rhizomes. That was a great question. Should have thought of that myself. So thank you. Anything else?
I need to transplant an elephant ear that's overgrown out of the terrarium. The soil, should we put that in? And would that be the half and half of the white soil orchid?
It's definitely one that I think would be happier in more airy soil. You could probably do more soil than bark, just to help hold on to moisture. They don't, in my experience at least, elephant ears don't love really fast drying out. And so having 25% bark and perlite, things like that, and 75% soil. I'm making up percentages here, but and having that kind of mix, it keeps them from getting really soggy, which elephant ears hate getting soggy, but it does prevent them from drying out within a day or two, which makes them unhappy also. So that'd be my recommendation. Any questions?
I was wondering how acidic the coconut coir is compared to the peat moss, which is also supposedly high acid.
I have seen research that coco coir likes to help grow fungus gnats. So there have been scientific research studies by workers on this, testing which substrates grow more pests. And so coco coir out of everything produces more fungus gnats than any other substrate. It's really easy to get. It's a lot cheaper than peat. It's also renewable, where peat is a non-renewable resource. And so I think coco coir tends to be a better choice just for ease and price. And I don't have an answer whether or not it's better for the environment, because I don't know how terrible farming coconut is. But they're both great resources. I see big commercial nurseries, they'll use straight coco coir to grow a lot of plants, and I think they do fine. It can sometimes smell like wet dog. If you leave the coco coir wet for too long, it gets really sticky. So. More good pro tips. Anything else? What else can I answer?
Did you address how often you change your water when you have something propagating? It just seems like it gets really cloudy and grungy at the bottom quickly. Are you changing that daily or how often?
You will absolutely hear recommendations from people to change the water daily. I think that's a lot of work, and I would never propagate if I needed to do that. I'll have algae grow in my cups, and it's completely fine. If you get huge algae overgrowth, you probably want to change out the water because the algae will start removing the oxygen from the water and cause problems for your plants. But really, you don't need to worry too much about changing the water or the substrate of your propagation unless you start having problems. Because some people say that their plants always rot unless they change water every single day. That's probably not true. I've never really had problems with propagation sitting in water for months. So, yeah, I wouldn't worry about changing out water unless you're seeing problems with your plant. If you start seeing rot in your cuttings, which will look like the stem or the petiole starts looking more transparent and just not quite solid anymore, that's when you might want to consider changing your water. You'll want to cut above that transparent area. Other than that, I don't think you really need to change water much. At least that's what I do.
Do you have an opinion on maybe which substrate is something with duplicates? Like as opposed like perlite as opposed to sphagnum? Or do you think it's kind of similar?
I think a lot of it's really similar. I like to use soil in my propagation boxes personally, because then as soon as they start having roots, they have immediate access to nutrients and things. But I've used sphagnum. I'll use that when I'm selling a lot because it's easier. I just leave the sphagnum attached and I put it in the mail, and it keeps it nice and moist all the way to its new home. But for my personal plants, I like soil. That's probably my favorite. It's easiest. You just don't have to do anything. You just set it in the dirt and it just grows. And so I think, I'm not sure what the rate of rooting looks like between the different substrates. I think it's pretty similar, but I think they tend to start growing again faster with soil. But when you have plants that are rooting, you generally won't see foliage growth. It's just metabolically expensive for plants to grow roots, so you'll tend to see leaf growth stop, even if you have a growth point on your plants already. So like these two cuttings, this is where a new leaf is coming. This will usually stop while the plant is growing new roots. And so some people panic and they think that they killed their plant. So if your plant looks like a plant still, you're fine. Just give it time. I've had cuttings take up to 6 months to root, especially if they're taken in the winter. Just for some reason, even when spring hits, they're still very stubborn and just don't want to transition into that root growth stage. I personally really love grow lights, especially in Montana. During the summertime, our maximum day length is about 16 hours. The winter is about 8 hours. So I personally wouldn't want to cut my food in half every day. That's not something I'd be on board with. And so plants can have some pretty significant changes going from summertime to wintertime here. And so when I take cuttings in the winter, I use grow lights for probably 80% of my plants. And I don't ever really have issues with winter cutting problems. But if your cutting is taking a while to grow, if it just looks like a plant, it's fine. Just give it time, be patient. That's probably one of the hardest things about propagation is just.
And the leaf will actually grow itself and even like get scars because of the expanding leaf.
Oh, cool.
But not grow a plant. At least not yet, like after months and months. So just that.
I would imagine some of it comes from how many of those undifferentiated cells end up attached to the end of your plant. So this will happen a lot with like Hoya Jerry, the heartleaf Hoyas, where you'll see around Valentine's Day, nurseries love to put the cute little hearts just in the soil and then they never grow because there's no stem attached. So plants like Hoyas and a lot of ficuses will grow roots but no growth points, so those kind of have this rooted leaf that will die eventually. But some, every once in a while, you'll hear stories, people, they wait 2 years and suddenly their one leaf is growing. And I think that just depends on the petiole is obviously connected to the node on your stem, and so in that connection, there's going to be undifferentiated cells. So I think it's just if the petiole or the end of the leaf or succulent just happens to break off some of those cells, or doesn't get any, kind of depends whether or not it's going to eventually be able to produce growth points or not. So that's my guess. I don't have more information about that, but that just based on I have a degree in biology. I forgot to say that. That would probably would have been helpful. I actually have a degree in ecology and evolutionary biology and environmental science from the University of Michigan. So I did a lot of this. I went to Peru for 2 months to do biological research in the Amazon. I love this stuff. Sorry, that was a great introduction that I should have told you guys about. So just based on my knowledge of cell biology and botany and plant development, that's my guess. But I have no citation. I think I'll get better at introducing myself in the future, so that will probably be more helpful for future talks. Any other questions? I do think a really, really helpful thing just for growing plants in general, if you don't have a great idea about what the care is, the physical characteristics of the plant are going to be really helpful for that. So plants like peperomias or philodendrons, if you feel that their leaves are pretty thick and waxy, and those are going to be plants that you don't really need to worry about high humidity. They're probably going to tolerate drying out most of the time. As the entry-level plants, especially when you get to more of the expensive, rarer plants, those tend to be more sensitive. But in general, entry-level plants, when they're kind of waxy like that, and then you don't need to worry about high humidity. It's helpful for propagation, but not necessary for growth long term. But when you have plants that are really delicate and have lots of little leaflets, so like ferns and fern fronds, when they're really thin and delicate, those are the kinds of plants that are probably going to need pretty high humidity to be happy. So if you're trying to figure out what care might look like when you're at a plant nursery, you don't know what a plant is, you want to know if you have the resources to care for it, that's usually a good rule of thumb. If it's more waxy, it's going to tolerate lower humidity and more drought conditions. But if it's kind of papery and has lots of little edges, then that's going to need higher humidity and probably dry out less. Wikipedia is also a great resource. If you know the name of your plant and you can find it on Wikipedia, or even just for plants like this, this is a cultivar of Philodendron heteraceum. So this doesn't have its own Wikipedia page, but the base species does. It will tell you where it's from, the environment that it's native to, and so that will be a great way to kind of learn about the plant further, how it might be happiest being planted. Does it need lots of bark in the soil? Does it grow up trees in the wild? Things like that. So that can give you a ton of advice, it's a great resource, a ton of information. Just to go to the Wikipedia page and just learn about where your plant is from. Is it from the desert in Africa? Probably doesn't need high humidity, but if it's native to Madagascar, it might need more humidity than you think. Anything else? Well, that's mostly what I have. I mean, I'm going to hang out here for a while. I'll probably go buy some plants because I have no self-control. So if you guys have questions, if you want to look at book excerpts, goodness, or anything like that, if you have more questions, I'll be around. But thank you for coming. This was a ton of fun. Thank you.